PowerPoint and just want to hit on a few things. I'm going to have to walk back and forth to the computer because I don't have a pointer that changes the slides, so sorry about that. So, legal intro 101 basic information. So to start, we have 3 court systems: state, federal, administrative. Anything we talk about is going to fall into one of these, and like I said, you may need to pull up your PowerPoint as we go through this because I know this coloring is not that great. But your federal court is obviously whole government, state, pretty clear. Administrative court would be different organizations like the FDA, they have certain policies, things like that. The main way we're going to see that is governing bodies, as in the NFL Players Union, and the way sports teams handle their own law. They kind of create their own system, their own rules, their own regulations, and they have a government within that. So all of our pro teams we talk about have a government within them that everything works through. So state court system, over everything that involves that state in particular. Court has authority to hear and decide a case. I'll talk a little more about this when we jump to federal. And then, so you can read that. So everything within the state is pretty straightforward. So here's a breakdown of what goes on. Just like we have a U.S. Supreme Court, we have a state Supreme Court. So the same function, you have districts, we have things like traffic, whatever. They all pass through this process. So when somebody gets in a situation at this level, then they would go to the appeals court. If a decision was made that the defendant disagreed with, it would get appealed and go to that next level and kind of be retried, and then it could eventually make it to the state Supreme Court and potentially the U.S. Supreme Court, which leads us to the federal court. So obviously that functions off the Constitution. That's pretty important, right? We know that. Federal laws, statutes, etc. And then the federal government is going to have, the federal court system is going to have to deal with disputes between citizens from state to state because they may have some different laws, and then also disputes that are really, really expensive. Next, we have our U.S. Supreme Court. So we have our different district courts, special federal or military situations. Same concept with a court of appeals, and then moving up to the United States Supreme Court. So federal district courts are the trial courts for the federal system. So basically where it originally happened, there's a trial there, and if it needs to move up, it will, and it's divided into 94 districts. Oh, by the way, a lot of this information will not be on the test, but it's kind of important for you as a human to know this stuff. So Court of Appeals, 11 circuit courts, 1 circuit for DC, may have appellate jurisdiction only. Like I said, I'm going to go through this pretty quick because I trust that you can read. If you have more questions, Google something. That's always a great resource. If you're really curious about something, you can ask me. I'll probably end up Googling it, but I just want to give you the basic info. So, U.S. Supreme Court, 9 justices comprised of Chief Justice and 8 associates, and their decisions are binding on all of their courts. So what happens in the U.S. Supreme Court is obviously a big deal because it took a lot for it to make it to that level. General little stuff doesn't make it that far. So, like I said, we're starting a few of these topics that I'm just going to kind of skip through because I want to focus on other things, and I know you're not going to pay attention to these videos if they're too long. So, like I said, these administrative court systems, they have jurisdiction over all matters of administrative law. That agency has responsibility for overseeing, except NLRB. That's one we'll talk about later this semester. So these agencies are in charge of their own rules and interpret rules how they see fit. Like I said, a good example of that is the NFL Players Union, their collective bargaining agreements, things like that. Rules that NFL players live by don't really apply to the rest of society. Things that they're worried about don't really make sense for you and I. So this is when a form of administrative law comes into play. So types of law: common law and statutory law. Common law is based on legal custom and precedent. Talk about that in a second. And then statutory law is based on legislation. A government body passes federal statutes, state statutes. So these are kind of weird things that happen that we have to base off. Well, this happened in this state. This is a really similar situation. Let's let's kind of proceed with what we've seen happen before. Whereas these are straight up incidents that have already been written down. They're statutes, they're based on legislation, they've already occurred. When you hear that a law has passed, a bill has passed, that's getting into those things, whereas this is a more specific scenario. And then we also have administrative law, laws, rules, legislation developed, adopted, and enforced by a specific government agency. We already talked about NLRB, that's one we'll deal with. Occupational Safety and Hazard Administration. Okay, here are two terms, precedent, stare decisis. Precedent is one that's going to come up a lot in here. So, because the reality is, there aren't a lot of laws, or there's not a lot of statutes, let's say, about, youth coach negligence. Like, not a ton of laws have been passed on that topic. But we can look at precedent and see what is negligence, what is not negligence by a coach, based on precedent, aka what has happened before, what court cases have been decided already on these topics. So, precedent is set when a court's decision in a previous case establishes a principle or rule, okay? So they look at a previous case to decide what to do in this current scenario. This principle or rule is then used by the court or other judicial bodies when deciding later cases with similar issues or facts. So that's what I'm saying when, okay, we heard this one issue with a coach-player problem of negligence or maybe harassment, something like that, and it's kind of a unique scenario. We can look at, say we're in Tennessee, we can look at something that was handled in Georgia, see what they did, and we can set a precedent based off that, because there may not be a statute to go by, so we need precedent. What has another court system decided to do? Stare decisis, principle that decisions of earlier cases will generally be followed by a court. So stare decisis basically supports the idea, the concept of precedence. You need to know these, okay? So plaintiff, defendants, in case you haven't watched Law & Order, all that stuff. So the person who files the lawsuit, and the defendant is the person or parties being sued, all right? So the plaintiff, sometimes known as the victim, things like that. The defendant is the one getting in trouble, and the plaintiff has gone through some form of damages, financially, emotionally, physically, etc. Something happened to them, and the defendant was the one who did it, and therefore they are being sued. Or they are claiming that the defendant is the one who did it. So we start with a complaint. So the first pleading identifies the plaintiff, defendants, and sets out the grievance. So the complaint is what actually happened, who did it, all that good stuff. The answer, a pleading by which the defendant, okay, so party A said, you did this. Party B says, whatever in response. That's our answer, okay? So the defendant tries to dispute the plaintiff, their claim, or asserting some defense which relieves the defendant of liability. So they may say, I did it, but I didn't have a duty to this person, which we'll see in a week or so. We'll hear a lot about duty in class. So complaint, answer, those are kind of the first steps in this process. Discovery is another one. So we have deposition and interrogatories. You've probably heard those terms before. We have pretrial motions. Summary judgment. That is basically saying, this isn't a legal issue, there's no problem, what you're complaining about isn't valid, let's move on. We have no case here. That's what summary judgment is saying. If you want to Google a fancier definition, you're more than welcome to, but it's basically the defendant saying, you got nothing. Or a judge or a lawyer, someone saying, you got nothing, is what summary judgment means. And then injunction, judicial order that restrains a person from being or continuing on action threatening or invading the legal right of another, or that compels a person to carry out a certain act to make restitution to an injured party. Long definition, okay? So that's all I have for that section. Just wanted to hit some big things. Plaintiff and defendant, you're gonna hear those a million times. If you don't know those terms, get them in your head. And things like federal, state, appellate court, appeals court, those are all terms that you are going to see a lot in this class. So you may want to go ahead and get used to those, okay? So that's PowerPoint 1, just a little introduction. Not a ton of that is on your first exam, but it's good stuff to know, okay? Have a good day.